Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jalen and today I have my November wrap up. I'm about to go run some errands, so it has to be kinda quick, but I won't rush through it, I promise. So, first up is Reprieve by James Hand Mattson. This is a book that I'm surprised hasn't blown up yet. It just came out in October, but I feel like this will be everywhere eventually, I think. So this one follows a cast of characters that are in this full contact haunted house. So when I heard this book was about a haunted house that was full contact, I was like, okay, sign me up. That sounds terrifying. I've always been intrigued. I used to love haunted houses when I was growing up. I'm talking about the walkthrough ones where things come out and scare you around Halloween time. It's one of those. But the actors are allowed to touch you, mess with you, things can drip on you. It's wild. And so we follow this cast of characters that is moving through this haunted house. And if you reach the end of the haunted house, you get a big cash prize. And only one group before this has ever won the prize. If anyone in your group says the word reprieve before you finish, then you are all kicked out and you don't win and you go home. The book opens and it is revealed that someone has been murdered in the last room of the haunted house. And so this book is actually deceptively smart, I think. This book is really looking at prejudice and race in the late 90s. Very similar to Miracle Creek by Angie Kim. If you like that book, I think you will love this one as well. But what I really thought was interesting about this book was the ways that all the characters who are implicated in what happens here are all kind of similar in what they are all longing for. So each of the characters, in my mind, are all really longing for love in a certain sense. So for example, one of the students that is in the haunted house, he is a gay international student who is longing for the affections of a teacher who he knows has moved to, I think this is set in Nebraska. And so he goes there in hopes of like reconnecting with this teacher that he had. But, you know, it seems a little far-fetched that that's going to work out for him. And so that's just one example. Other characters have similar dynamics going on. But you learn more about why these characters are there, what their connection is to the crime that happens, and why all of this occurred. And so I think it's a really interesting look at racism in the late 90s, while also maintaining a quite thrilling sense throughout. So you see each of the rooms that the characters go through, and so that part reads more like a thriller. You are kind of grossed out by what happens to them. It's kind of unnerving, thinking about like what you would do in those situations. But in between those sections, you learn more about each of the characters and why they're all here. So I think if you really like literary horror thriller novels, this is one for you for sure. It is so smart. I could see it being a really, really good movie. I really enjoyed it. I had a really good time and I couldn't put it down. I picked this one up on Halloween and it was like perfect for that vibe. I know it's no longer Halloween, but I think if you like that, check it out. Next up, I finished The Corrections by Jonathan Franzen, and if you've been following my channel, you know I stan. I love Jonathan Franzen so far from what I've read. I've only read 2 of his novels, but I already have most of his other books because I'm obsessed with his writing. This one is similar to his recently released Crossroads. This one came out right before 9/11. Follow this family in the late 90s. They're a Midwestern family, similar vibes to Crossroads. So it's basically this very chaotic family dynamic, which I guess Franzen is quite known for. And I can totally see the inklings of what Franzen does so well in his fiction in this book. I think it's why it's so loved by so many people. I do think overall Crossroads is a slightly better novel. It feels a little bit less manic and a little less zany, but that doesn't mean it's not a bad thing that this book kind of has some more chaotic overall in terms of its kind of storytelling, its plotting, and some of the things that happen to these characters. It's a little bit more loose in its narrative structure compared to Crossroads. I think I like the more traditional feel of Crossroads overall. It feels a little bit more contained and mature. It's also looking at a period in the 70s rather than the late 90s, but I do think these books go really well together as interesting explorations of a family and what each of the characters desire in the family and how those desires are kind of held down by other members of their family and how they navigate those kind of things. Like what expectations do your family have for you and what do you owe them versus what do you not? When do you put yourself first within your own personal family, but even like your childhood family? How do you kind of balance those two things? This book has a lot going on. It's hard for me to like distill it in a very coherent way. But there are 3 kids and 2 parents. The father seems to be on a quite rapid decline, suffering from Parkinson's disease. The crux of the story is the mother character, Enid. She wants to have one last Christmas with her 3 kids in the event that Alfred, the father, he dies. A lot of this book is about Enid trying to get her kids back home with her, and you kind of see in this kind of darkly humorous way how much Enid is longing for family despite her kids kind of rejecting it for various reasons that you learn about. You see her in her dynamic with Alfred in their marriage and how it's failing in many ways, and the ways that she's been treated in the past. She, like in Crossroads, feels kind of like the core of the book in a sense. Every character is given a good amount of pages, and you learn more about how they're all fucked up, to put it lightly. If you want a long, funny, deeply character-rich, incredible prose look at the late 90s and how a lot of the themes that are explored here in terms of like globalism, capitalism, climate anxiety, a lot of that is portrayed here, which is really interesting to read because I feel like that's so common in, you know, current contemporary fiction, but it was just as on the minds of writers in this time as well. I don't really read a lot of backlist titles like this, so it's really interesting to kind of get that perspective and, you know, pre-9/11 see what was predicted to come in the 2000s. And so I think this is a really interesting meditation from Franzen on what was to come. It just feels like an accomplishment, a feat of a novel. Every time I read one of his books, I'm just completely in awe. It's such an amazing, immersive experience where you don't want to put the book down and you really feel like you know these characters by the end of it. He's just a wonderful writer to read, and that's what I'm looking for in fiction, baby. So I don't know. I love Franzen. I know he's controversial, but he slaps. He slaps. What can I say? Next up, I have The Undocumented Americans by Karla, Cornejo, Villavicencio. This book absolutely slapped. That's like my favorite word these days. It slapped, though. It slapped. I read this book in 2 quick sittings. I was just like in awe. I read this for Nonfiction November. It's been on my TBR for quite a while. It's incredibly moving and smartly reported book, looking at a bunch of undocumented Americans and just learning about their lives and what their experiences are like being undocumented. What seems to be a clear goal of this book for Karla is looking at the ways in which undocumented Americans are often stereotyped and thought of in one certain way, but she wants to look at just their daily lives and their desires and their dreams and their aspirations and why they are the way that they are and how those things are limited by white supremacy and general corruption in the United States and the various obstacles that they have to overcome to just purely live and exist in America. What I do think is so clever about this book is it's not just a pure set of reporting on a certain number of people. It is also a quite personal look at Karla's experience being on DACA and how the impetus for this book was basically right at the time of Trump winning the election in 2016, how she wanted to explore what it means to be undocumented for herself and for other people around her, and just telling those stories in the ways that she traveled across the United States to learn more about them. And so some really interesting aspects of this book are that she looks at the Flint water crisis in Michigan. She also looks at how undocumented Americans were treated around 9/11 and how they were also, in a sense, first responders to the disaster. It's quite literary in the sense that she gets a little bit, what is the word I'm looking for? For lack of a better word, like experimental in her reporting in certain parts of it. I love when she dabbled in that. I thought she is a brilliant writer. She's very clear and precise and direct in a way that it's really digestible, but at the same time, I was in awe at how she's able to distill so much of these people in these short chapters or essays. I think that is a must read. If you're looking for a nonfiction book to read, this is a book I'm going to be recommending like at the top of my list. Like if you want nonfiction, read The Undocumented Americans. It is incredible. That was definitely a standout for me this month. And on the other hand, I read a book that I did not love. The only one I didn't really love this month, so it's all right, but I read Tin Man by Sarah Winman. And I know this book was quite a booktube darling at one point, I think like 2017. People really like this book. I think it's won some awards. It's quite popular, but I didn't really vibe with it. So it's this quite short novel. I think it's under 200 pages or a little over 200 pages. So this can be read like in a single sitting. The pages are quite small. I didn't read it in that sense, which I kind of wish I did. I think that might have played a little bit into why I didn't like it as much as I probably could have. But I didn't get much from this. I'll just keep it kind of short. It is about these 3 friends and the various love entanglements that they all have with each other. And so we meet 2 boys who meet each other when they're, I think, in their early teens, and they eventually fall in love. So this is a look at being queer in a time when it was less accepted. Then you learn, there's a time jump in a sense where one of those boys is now married to their close friend and the other boy is not in the picture anymore. The rest of the book is kind of filling in those gaps, finding out why these 2 boys kind of fell apart, and ultimately the triangle friendship between all of them despite the romantic entanglements that have ensued amidst their friendships, if that makes sense. That was the worst way of summarizing that book, but bear with me, all right? So why I did not love this book is because sometimes I find in these short, wide time period novels that are also quite lyrical and poetic, this book felt a little bit uncontained, uncontrolled, and was confusing at times, was kind of lacking in a sense in characterization. And I know a lot of people that read this book will probably be like, what are you talking about? Like, people adore these characters in the reviews that I've read. People love this story and they think it's gorgeous, but to me, it felt at times overly sentimental. It felt a touch obvious, and a little, I feel like I've heard and read this story so many times before that it's been done in a much more effective and creative way that I appreciate that Sarah Winman is doing what she does in this small scope, but I just didn't love the writing style that at times felt a little bit too flowery, for lack of a better word, a little bit too cloying for my taste. I didn't love it. And I was kind of surprised because I want to read more queer literature. That's been a goal of mine, or it's going to be a goal of mine for next year. I feel like as a queer man myself, I don't read enough queer fiction. I just did not care where the story was going for some reason. I felt very detached from the narrative and from the characters, and I think it's because of the way that Sarah Winman jumps back and forth in time. It felt very spastic and not contained, and I didn't enjoy it, so didn't love that one. I know I'm probably in the minority there, but is what it is. Then I read The Isle of Youth, a short story collection by Laura Vandenberg, who is currently my favorite short story writer, hands down. She is a mad genius, in my opinion. I don't understand how she's able to do what she does with the short story form. To me, every time I pick up a Laura Vandenberg story, you know it's going to be perfectly crafted. It's going to capture you from the first page, if not the first sentence. You're going to get characters that are going to be going through something, and what I love most about her stories is that anyone that is in a story, you should be scared. If you're in a Laura Vandenberg story, you should be scared for your life, because she will kill you in the last sentence, she will dismember you in the last page, or in the middle of the story. You just never know where her story's gonna go, and she holds nothing back. These stories are often quite bleak, but really amazing character studies of people that are often going through a tumultuous point in their life. This seems to be a running through line in a lot of her stories, is that we look at women kind of on the edge in the ways that they are grappling with certain conflicts, usually violence at the hands of men, coming to terms with choices that they made in their lives or choices that they have yet to make and the impacts of those decisions. And every story, while they are quite different from each other in terms of plot, they all feel so central, and it's such a good collection of stories about women dealing with these things, often grief, often trauma. They're just perfect. It's just she's just perfect. I'm sorry. I really, you read her story and you're like, okay, well, damn, can you leave some for the rest of us? How can you be that talented at writing a short story? Don't understand it. Incredible. Read her stuff if you haven't already. It's just so good. It's so good. Next up, I read The Vet's Daughter by Barbara Comyns. This seems to be a kind of lesser known book, but I see on literary Twitter circles, people are always talking about Barbara Comyns and how she should be read more. And so I picked this up as my first New York Review of Books book, as I want to read a lot of those next year. I hear that they slap. I hear they're kind of hidden gems, often 1900s literature, and I want to read more of that. I want to read a little bit less pure new releases and try to really dabble in backlists, because I know there's so much that I'm missing out on, and I really want to make that a priority for next year. So I read this one, and I really liked it. It wasn't a new favorite by any means, but I really enjoyed. It felt like this kind of blend of Shirley Jackson and Stephen King a bit, which is on the blurb, and so I'm totally stealing from the blurb or the synopsis, but it's very true. This book feels quite like We Have Always Lived in the Castle mixed with Carrie with a touch of The Lottery, sort of. That's the vibe. So basically we follow this young woman, I think she's 17. I'm pretty sure. She lives in this London suburb with her dad and her mom. So the dad is a vet, and he is one of the biggest pieces of shit I've ever read in a book. He is trash, garbage, throw him out, evil. I can't. He's the worst. He is a vet who treats the daughter, the main character, and his bedridden wife, who is going to soon die, extremely poorly. He is abusive. He is completely without warmth. Even to the pets, he often sells pets to, I forget what they call it. Basically a person who wants to experiment on the animals for whatever reason. It's so fucked up. But so the dad had me pressed when I was reading this book, and it makes you really care for the main character, Alice, who is living at home with her mom and trying to care for her while also dealing with a piece of shit dad. Eventually the mom does pass, and then a new woman comes into the picture, and she is also trash and treats Alice poorly. And then you see the way she navigates these very fraught relationships with her dad and now her stepmom. What really is the turning point in this book is Alice starts to understand that she has a power. Basically, I won't spoil it too much, but she finds herself, I think in her sleep, if I recall correctly, she starts levitating, and she can kind of control what she's doing when she's levitating, and then you see the fallout that ensues when she understands that she has this power. The ending of this book is what really sold it for me. Not expected. This book is, I will say, incredibly bleak and grim and depressing a lot of the time, but I really liked the way that Barbara Comyns writes with a sense of very, very dark humor throughout, and I really loved the main character Alice and seeing her dealing with all of this trauma that she has at the hands of her dad. It's very readable. You can read this in one sitting as well. I think it's like under 150 pages. But if you like Shirley Jackson, I think you definitely should try this book. It doesn't have that many reviews on Goodreads. It's like under 2,000 rating, so I would check it out if that sounds good. Next up, a book that I also loved was Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga. I don't know how to say her last name. I've been meaning to look this up. It's Olga Tokarczuk, I think. I apologize. Translated by Antonia Lloyd-Jones. This book was so good, and it is very eerily similar to one of my favorite books of all time, Death in Her Hands. And I've seen this connection made in some reviews. I almost want to like do a video on these two books maybe. I don't know. Just an idea I had, but there are so many parallels here. In this book, we follow an older Polish woman who is living alone in a cabin in this kind of more like secluded area, like in the forest, in the woods. And one night she's awoken by her neighbor who says that another neighbor in this little village has died. Basically what happens throughout the rest of this book is it is discovered that various hunters of animals are being killed, and we see how our main character, Janina, starts to investigate these killings. She believes that the animals are murdering these hunters. This is a murder mystery of sorts, but what I loved most about this book is that it really is a very deep and complex character study of this woman who is often belittled and disregarded for her opinions, and you see her trying to communicate to the police what she thinks is going on and how they completely just dismiss her as a crazy old woman. You see her kind of ruminate on various philosophical things, which I love so much about this book that I feel like not a lot of people talk about. I've seen in reviews of this book, but I really love the ways that she uses like typology and philosophy to think through issues. So the main thing that she uses is astrology. She loves astrology. She tries to find like various structures or typologies to classify people and to try to understand the world around her. And I love the way that she did that in this book. The ways that those things play into the revelations as the story goes on was amazing. And this book gets quite dark by the end of it, and I thought it was just kind of like badass. I don't know, like I really enjoyed where the story went, and overall I loved this character. She's very complex and messy and feels quite Mashdagian, similar to the narrator of Death in Her Hands, who also is investigating a murder mystery and the ways that kind of goes south and not where you expect it to. I love that book. I love the writing, and I just loved the philosophical explorations all within the backdrop of this like murder mystery about animals and the environment. It was very cool. I like the environment, like the atmosphere of this book. I don't know, it was just very good. It was good. I highly recommend it. Okay, 3 more books. Next I read White on White. This one is definitely for fans of Rachel Cusk and Katie Kitamura. Like Rachel Cusk outline vibes to the fullest. If I read this book and I didn't know who the author was, I could totally see this being Rachel Cusk. And I hope that the author and the publisher don't hate that comparison, but it's like very true. Basically, we follow this woman who is a student who is renting this apartment, and she is basically studying Gothic nude paintings from the 12th and 13th centuries. And so she rents this apartment from a painter. Her name is Agnes, and she lives with her husband in another city, I think, but they have this apartment like in a town where the student is studying. And so she rents it from Agnes, but Agnes is living currently in the studio like above the apartment, so they kind of share a space together. And so you don't know much about the narrator of this book, who's the student, but she starts to listen to various things that Agnes tells her about her life, about her paintings, about her relationship with her husband. The narrator doesn't really give too much input into herself or even into what Agnes is telling her, so it's very similar to Outline, where we have a narrator who's listening to various musings of people and not really giving much back to them or to the reader. So you get like a faint outline of what the character is. And very similar here, this book is called White on White, about nude sculptures. And so you kind of feel like you have a vague understanding of what the student is. But as the novel goes along, you get a very clear picture of who Agnes is. But it is quite deceptive in the ways in which Agnes is presented. And this book is very much about the liminal spaces of various dualities. And so we see nearly every sentence of this book is, one, beautifully crafted, but often rooted in contrast, contradictions, foil, looking at very, opposing ideas or sentiments or feelings and emotions about various subjects, mainly from Agnes, and how those kind of play out in the backdrop of like art and Agnes's character herself and her desires and her passions and what's holding her back. And it was just done so well. I feel like I'm not selling it enough like I should, or explaining it well. I just loved the ideas presented here, especially using the idea of sculptures and paintings to kind of illuminate something deeper or like a lying beneath the art is very well done here. More so, it's really looking at personal intimacy and relationships, which is why I also think it's kind of similar to Katie Kitamura, who does this very well in her book Intimacies, looking at the reading between the lines of interpretation and how that is also played out in personal relationships. And the ending of this book, when I finished it, I was like, oh my God. I did not expect it to go where it went. Nothing violent happens, but there is a bit of like a twist that occurs. I was like, oh my God, it's like darkly sinister in a way. I got like light chills. I was like, that was a ride. That was wild. Beautiful and reflective and philosophical as well. So good. Cusk fans, just go read it and you'll know what I mean. Next up, I read Lemon by Kwon, Yeo-sun. This book is a literary murder mystery of sorts. I saw a really rave review of this in the New York Times, and I wanted to read it after reading that. But I will say I was a little bit disappointed by this book, mostly because the structure and the chronology of this book and what is kind of left out feels more confusing and a little less fulfilling than I would have liked, but I know that that is the intention here. So I feel like I'm asking this book to be something that it's not, but I can't deny that when I was reading this, I just felt a little bit unsatisfied in terms of the story. So basically, we know that a murder occurred in 2002 of a Korean teenager. There are two people that could have done it, but the case goes unresolved. One of them is this more shy, poor student who witnesses something, and then the other one is a potential love interest of the girl that is murdered and whether he has a motive to do it, but he has a very strong alibi. The rest of the story is told from three different perspectives from people that are all touched by this murder. The focus of the book is from the girl's sister, who is 2 years younger than her, but kind of felt more like an older sister to her, who is not as beautiful as her sister, who was described as basically being like a perfect beauty, and that kind of plays into why she was murdered, and the ideas of beauty between sisters and the kind of competitiveness that happens in those situations. And you see the ways that the death of her sister, how she goes to lengths to kind of replicate herself in the image of her sister who is now gone for the sake of her mother. And you see those kind of fraught relationships. We also see two other characters that are impacted by this. Each perspective kind of lends itself to solving who did this murder, but more so this book is about how this murder impacted these three characters and the fallout that ensues from it. The book doesn't really clearly tell you what happened to the girl, but you kind of get a faint understanding of what happened, and it's more so just a rumination on these questions of privilege and beauty. And so overall, I felt quite mixed on it, but it was a really, I think, kind of a clever book, but it just didn't do much for me aside from that. It's a very quick read, so if you do like a quick literary murder mystery, I would recommend it for that, but don't go into it expecting too much of like a traditional detective, everything solved for you story. It's more so a character study, I would say. And then the last book I finished was Painting Time by, I don't know how to say her name. I think it's Maylis de Kerangal. I know it is translated from the French by Jessica Moore. And this is a book that came on my radar because one of my favorite authors, writers, Lauren Euler, she posted about it on Instagram like back in the day. And so I know CJ, she also picked this one up and loved it. If Lauren Euler loves it, if CJ loves it, then I think I'm going to love it. In short, this book is about a young woman in her early 20s who goes to this art institute in Brussels to learn how to become a decorative painter. And so this is a very clear coming-of-age story about a young student who is trying to find a profession and move through her feelings of being sort of lost and trying to determine what you want to do. And so myself, as a recently graduated lawyer, I love this book because I could relate. You know, being in a more technical profession, in a more specific study where you're kind of isolated with a certain group of people, all focusing on one thing, can be quite competitive and makes you question your self-worth and whether you can actually do it if you pick the right thing. And, you know, kind of being first away from home and where you're used to being. Like I've loved all the ideas explored here because I could definitely relate. But what I think this book does so well is looking at the ways that the main character, Paula, she navigates two relationships with two friends that she has. One which she is clearly in love with, and then another who is just her friend, but they also bond in this kind of trio relationship. Kind of similar to Tin Man, but this is like miles better. But you see the painstaking task of being a decorative painter and how the impacts of it on her body are significant. She has many sleepless nights, and you see the ways in which decorative painting is a quite skilled profession. It was wild reading the descriptions of or what decorative painting entails. That's the first half of the book, and the second half of the book is when Paula is tasked with a job. So she's, you know, jumping around jobs, and she finally gets one in which she has to recreate certain cave paintings that are considered to be like the first art in the world, and she's not allowed to see the painting. So usually in decorative painting, you're given a reference, whether it's like wood or certain marble, and you're supposed to directly copy what that looks like in her painting. But this is the first time where she's had to do something just from images and not actually see the thing itself, but it's considered to be like one of the most acclaimed pieces of art that there is. You see how she navigates that and how her love interest, how it kind of follows her throughout her entire university life and now in her career and where that all ends up. So basically this book is just beautifully crafted and told. The prose here just like blew my mind. She has these very long, crafty sentences with lots of commas. And I watched this review of Jen Campbell, and she says that what the sentences feel like or like the author is kind of painting a picture for you of everything that she's describing. And that is so true. I've never read prose like this where it just feels so like unique and original in the sense that it's presented in these long, descriptive, big vocab. Like, it was a quite challenging read for me just from my lack of knowledge of painting and art generally. But I will say just the story and the coming of age aspects of this I love so much, and it really compelled me to read more. And the love interest at stake was very interesting to read about and just beautifully presented. I do think if you like Sally Rooney, but you want something a little less clean and precise, maybe a little bit more lyrical in presentation about art. If you like art and Sally Rooney, basically check this one out. I really liked it. It's a great novel. From a pure craft perspective, I was like, this is wild. Yeah, so that is my November wrap-up. It was overall a pretty great reading month, aside from one book. Let me know the best book that you read this month. I'm always curious to know what you all are reading. I am nosy like that. I want to know. Give me the hot recommendations. But anyways, I will catch you in the next one. Bye.